Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of James Richardson and the murder of George Pegg, which took place in Walker in 1901. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do these days, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. James Richardson was born in around 1883 in Durham to parents George and Mary, and he was one of at least 9 children, and was around 18 years old in 1901. He lived with his sister Sarah and brother-in-law George in Walker, and he worked as a miner at the colliery in Wallsend. He was not described as a heavy drinker, but was known to drink a little. And he was also known to have a revolver, and it was said by his sister that he had this for amusement and he often shot seagulls with it. George Pegg, the victim, was born in around 1856 in Norfolk to parents George and Ellen, and he was also one of at least 9 children. He was a little older than his wife Sarah, who he had married in Sunderland in 1895, and George had previously been married and was a widower at the time of his marriage to Sarah. I did not find any mention of children from his first marriage, and I also found no evidence of any children for George and Sarah. At the time of his death, George was around 45 years old and worked as a miner, and he was described by some as a man who was prone to drinking and sometimes violent behaviour. On October the 25th, 1901, George headed home from his day's work at Wallsend. His brother-in-law James, who he shared his home with, had arrived home a little earlier, and the two men had a brief conversation about money in the yard before James went off with his friend Thomas Brown to go to the theatre. James returned a short time later to collect his revolver, apparently making a joke about wanting to see if he could knock anyone down tonight. George had also left the house and was out drinking with friends. James returned home a little before 10 p.m. and spent the next hour playing dominoes with Thomas before heading to bed a short while before George came home. Sarah tried to get George to stay home, thinking that he had drank enough, but he went back out again and did not return home until the following morning. And when he came home then, he was very drunk, and on seeing his brother-in-law James, he started to call him names, and stated that he would have to move out of the house if he did not give him more money. James was polite with his replies, asking how much he wanted, but not really getting a reply, so a short time later he decided to go out for the day. All was quiet until around 10:30 p.m. when James attempted to return home and George would not let him in. James told him to open the door, adding that he would shoot him. George, who was still angry but thinking nothing would happen, opened the door to speak to James, and within minutes of doing so, 2 shots hit him in the chest. He ran down the stairs and into the lane, shouting that he had been shot. It seems that neither doctor nor police were sent for, and George was simply taken to Walker Hospital, where he was treated by Dr. Grindley, who noted immediately that George had been shot, and it was the doctor who sent for the police. George told Sergeant Scott that it had been James Richardson who had shot him, and he immediately went to find him. However, it would be October the 28th before James was found at Gateshead and arrested for the wounding of George Pegg. George died on November the 6th at Walker Hospital, and James Richardson was then charged with his willful murder. The inquest was held at the Corporation Hotel in Walker before Deputy Coroner Rutherford. Sarah Pegg said she had identified the body as being that of her husband George Pegg, who was 45 years old and worked as a miner at Wallsend Colliery. She said her brother James, the accused, also worked at the colliery and had been lodging with them for around 3 months. She stated that on October the 25th she had been at home in Walker when her husband came in from work. James was already there, and she said the 2 men spoke about money. George had asked James, "Have you got my money, Jimmy?" And James had replied saying, "No, what have I got to do with your money?" She did not see it as being an argument, just a brief discussion. After this, she said, George said he was going back to Wallsend and James went out to the theatre with his friend Thomas Brown. She said James returned after a few moments to get his revolver, but she did not take much notice of this as she knew he sometimes shot birds for fun. After he left, she said she had gone out herself, returning at around 10 p.m, when she found James and Thomas at home playing dominoes. George, she said, returned home around 11 p.m. He was a little worse for the drink and she tried to persuade him not to go out again, but he ignored her and did not return until the following morning. She said James and George had not spoken as James had already gone to bed before James came home that night. The following morning, she said George returned to their home at around 11 a.m. He was very bad with the drink and started to argue with James about money, telling him he would have to leave the house if he did not pay more for his stay. James, she said, left a short time later and George told her he would not get back into the house without paying more. She said she had gone out herself and later that night around 10 p.m. she was passing her home on the way to a friend's house when James stopped her. He said he was not able to get into the house and he asked her, "Who has told George how much money I give you?" She replied that she had, as George had forced her to tell him. James then told her that George had tried to kick him, but he had missed, and he said if not, he would have knocked him down for it. She later heard James on the stairs to their home shouting at George to let him inside. She claimed she had heard him say, "I'll be at work on Monday morning, George, but you will not." She did not know what he meant by this, but she shouted up telling him to come away, but he did not, so she left him there. A few moments later she heard the sound of 2 gunshots, but she did not think anything of it. Later, on her way home, she was told someone had been shot, and she soon realised it had been her husband. She had visited him at the hospital in Walker the next day, and he had died on November the 6th. They had not really spoken about what had happened and how he had been shot. Thomas Brown said he was 14 years old and lived in Walker. He was a friend of James Richardson. He said on the night of October the 25th he was to go to the theatre with James, but he changed his mind, so they went to a show in Walker. James took his revolver with him. They went back to James's lodgings around 10 p.m. to play dominoes. He said he left to go home not long after this. He did not hear any words being spoken between George and James that night, but he knew that they had argued over money, as James had told him of it. And on the night of the 26th, he said he had again been with James near to his lodging. James had not been able to get inside, and Thomas said they had heard someone making a noise, and James said he thought it was George, so he was going to see if he could get past him and inside the house. Thomas said James was still not able to get in, and he told him, "If I can get George outside, I will go a couple of rounds with him in the yard." Thomas assumed this meant to fight him, and after this, James said, "If he comes down those steps, I will shoot him." Thomas said he had seen the revolver belonging to James, and the one produced at the inquest was the same one. James had hold of it when he said he would shoot George. Thomas said he left James at the top of the stairs, but he had not gone far when he heard the sound of 2 gunshots. He saw George run down the stairs shouting that he had been shot, with James running behind him. Thomas ended by saying that a man had took hold of James and asked him what had happened, and he said he heard James say, "I have done the deed now, I have shot George. If the police want to come and take me, they can." But Thomas said the police were not sent for, and James left the area to go to Gateshead. It was said that George had been carried to Walker Hospital, where he was seen by the doctor and admitted. Dr. Grindley said that George was admitted to the hospital with gunshot wounds to the chest and hip. He said there was very little external bleeding. He had been able to locate and remove 1 bullet from the chest, but George deteriorated and died on November the 6th. He had later performed the post-mortem and had found an abscess on the lung and also found the 2nd bullet inside the lung. It was his professional opinion that George had died from pneumonia caused by the injury to his lung, and that the direct cause of death had been the gunshot wounds. Sergeant Tate said on November the 7th he had gone to the home of George Pegg and searched the house. Here he had found a box of cartridges. He said a man by the name of Edward Lowe, who was another brother-in-law of James Richardson, showed him where the revolver had been buried. He said the gun had been fired twice and the bullets matched those in the box he had found and those found in the body of George Pegg. Sergeant Tuff said, acting on information received, he had gone to the home of a man named Edward Lowe who lived in Gateshead on October the 28th. Here he found James Richardson and charged him with wounding George Pegg. He said James replied saying, "All right, if he had not sprang at me, I would not have done it. When he sprang at me, I pulled the trigger twice and brought him down." Later, Sergeant Tubb said James told him he had planned to give himself up on the Saturday night, but he had changed his mind, but would have done so soon if he had not been arrested. Sergeant Tuff said when George died, he had charged James with the willful murder of George Pegg and asked him where the revolver was. He said James told him, "I did it in self-defence, and if you go to my sister's house in Gateshead, you will find the gun under the floor next to the window." Sergeant Tubb said the gun was not there, but Edward Lowe had directed them to the woods where it had been buried. A statement had been taken from George Pegg before his death, and this was read out at the inquest. In brief, George said he did not know why James had shot him. They had never had any words previously. He knew that James had a revolver, and he said that this was used for shooting birds. He didn't worry about it being in the house. When the first shot was fired, George said he had been very close to James, but he then ran from him, being shot the second time as he was running away. He said he had never attacked James that night before he was shot, and after the second shot he said he had ran a short way before collapsing and had been carried to the hospital at Walker by some men who had found him lying on the ground. The coroner then spoke to the jury, stating that it was for them to decide if this had been a case of willful murder. Did James intend to kill George, or was it an accident, and James had never meant to kill George, perhaps only intending to frighten him in the hope that he would let him back into the house? The jury retired for several minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of willful murder, and James Richardson was committed for trial and removed to Newcastle Prison. I did not find any details of a funeral for George Pegg. The funerals are not always covered in the local papers, and this means that it is impossible to know for sure if the family took care of the burial or if this became another case of a pauper's funeral. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for George Pegg anywhere in the local area. The trial took place at the Moot Hall in February of 1902 before Mr. Justice Ridley. James Richardson pleaded not guilty to the charge of willful murder. Most of the evidence given at the trial was the same as at the inquest, so I will, as usual, only include new or different information. Sarah Pegg gave very similar evidence to that at the inquest. However, when she was questioned, she added that George could be very violent when he had been drinking, and that she had been worried what he would do to James if he tried to get into the house. She said she had believed that weekend that George was going to hit her, then adding that he had hit her, and she thought he would do it again. The judge at this point said he was surprised to hear this, as she had never mentioned this before, and he felt it was better that she told the truth. And Sarah then changed her statement, saying that George had not hit her, but she had been afraid that he would do so and was worried that he would attack James. Thomas Brown gave almost the same evidence as at the inquest, only adding that when George had first opened the door to James, he had said to him, "Come in, Jimmy, there is a good bed for you and Sarah here." But he said James did not go in, and he still seemed angry with George. He said he had left after this, as he had heard his mother calling for him to go home, so he did not see or hear any more other than the shots that he heard a few moments later. And he said he believed that George was drunk at the time, as he had seen him staggering on the stairs when he opened the door, but he did not think James was the worse for drink, although he knew that he had been drinking that day. Robert Jenkins said he lived close to George Pegg in Walker. He said he had heard James shouting for George to let him inside the house. He then saw 3 men talking on the stairhead. They were quiet, he said, just talking and not arguing. He heard no more until a few minutes later when he heard the sound of gunshots. He'd ran back towards the house, but by the time he arrived, the area was deserted. Frederick Smith said he also lived near George Pegg in Walker. He said on the night in question he had seen George running away. He was shouting, "I have been shot." He then saw him fall to the ground. With the help of some other men, one being John Hurst, they carried George to Walker Hospital. Frederick said he later spoke to James and asked him what had happened, and he said he told him, "I have shot him," and he then walked away. John Hurst gave the same evidence as Frederick Smith. Edward Lowe said he lived at Gateshead and James was his brother-in-law. He said James had arrived at his home in the early hours of October the 27th. He had asked him what had brought him there at that time of night, and James replied that he had argued with George and George had attacked him, so he'd shot him twice. Edward said he did not deny shooting George, but said it was in self-defence. He said James had the revolver with him, he was upset and crying, so they had buried the gun under the floor in the house. He said later he had taken the gun himself and buried it in nearby woods, and when questioned about this he said he had done so to keep it away from his children. James Richardson spoke on his own behalf. He said he was a putter at Wallsend Colliery and lived with his sister and brother-in-law. He said that the evidence given by Thomas Brown was not the truth. He said he had never threatened George in any way, certainly not saying to Thomas that he would shoot him if he came outside, and that he did not have the revolver in his hand when he was talking to Thomas. He said that when George opened the door, he rushed at him and grabbed him by the throat, pushing him to the ground with his knee on his chest, saying, "Now, Jim, your last hour has come." James said it was at this point that he remembered the revolver in his pocket and thought if he fired it, it might make George let go of him, so he did this, firing twice, not thinking that he had hit him. He said he had been afraid for his life when George had him on the ground. When asked, he said he had not had any kind of discussion about money with George on the previous night, nor had they had words that weekend, but he had known that George was drunk and angry. He admitted that he had said, "I will be at work on Monday and you will not," but he said he simply meant because George would not have recovered from drinking all weekend, not that he planned to kill him. I did not find any details of the prosecution's closing statement. However, the defence stated that this was clearly a case of James acting in self-defence. He had been afraid for his life when George had attacked him and had used the revolver to frighten the man not to shoot and kill him, and that his death was an accident. The judge, in summing up, said people should really not be allowed to carry guns with them for no reason. In this case, here was a man of only 18 years of age, taking a revolver with him when he was meant to be going for a night out with a friend. A more dangerous practice he could not imagine, and the result of carrying this gun around with him was evident for all to see. He said it was for the jury to decide if James had intended to kill George, though for what reason it was hard to say, or if he had indeed been afraid for his life and killed George in self-defence. The jury retired for 20 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against James Richardson. The judge, addressing James, said he believed the jury had reached the correct verdict, though he felt they had taken a lenient view of his crime, only finding in favour of manslaughter and not murder. He then sentenced James to 12 years penal servitude. Although I was unable to find out which prison James was sent to serve his sentence, I do know that he did not serve the full 12 years, as by 1911 he was once again living with his sister Sarah and her second husband in Durham, so it does appear that she did forgive him for killing her first husband. This was a very strange case. There does not seem to have been any motive for James to shoot his brother-in-law. He claimed that they did not argue at all, although others suggest that they had disagreed over money, but nothing seems to be bad enough for him to want to shoot him. However, he did claim that George had attacked him that night on the stairs, and this, he claimed, had been why he had shot him in self-defence. And although his sister did try to claim at the trial that George had hit her, which she later retracted, James at no point in time suggested that he felt his sister was ill-used by her husband, so this was certainly not something that could have been seen as a motive. I simply can't come up with a reason for what he did. Was he perhaps more drunk than Thomas said and simply had no idea what he was doing with the gun, perhaps naive enough to think he could fire and not kill? Or was he really attacked by George and afraid for his life? I think the jury had a very difficult job to do based on the different evidence, and that they had to work out what was the truth and what was not, and it was very difficult in this case. But I do think that it should have been a case of murder. However, at least the judge gave him a harsher sentence and not the usual 12 months or less that we have seen with some of the recent cases. But what do you think? Do you think James was a foolish boy playing a dangerous game with a gun and killed George by accident? Or do you think he was afraid for his life and shot in self-defense? Or do you think the evidence leans more towards James wanting to shoot his kill his brother-in-law for no known reason? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.